Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Disciple Hour, episode 33. Today's topic is the criminalization of Christianity and how to push back. I am joined by Ian and Gentile Gentleman, and this episode will be constructed in the following manner. We will begin to discuss a very disgusting bill being passed in Congress right now, IHRA 6090, the so-called Antisemitism Awareness Act. We will discuss some outrage over it, a justified outrage. We will talk about the impact of this bill and why this is being pushed, and then finally the solutions to it. So, brothers Ian and Gentile Gentlemen, would you like to say hi?
Hello, everyone. This is Ian.
Hey, good morning, everyone. This is Gentile.
The so-called Antisemitism Awareness Act, or HR 6090, is currently going through Congress of the United States. This bill outlaws anti-Semitism without even defining it. Instead, they reference the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition of anti-Semitism. They provide a universal and very open definition of anti-Semitism, which includes certain Bible verses indirectly, such as 1 Thessalonians 2:14-15, John 19:11, and Matthew 27:25. When I say indirectly, I mean they provide an example of anti-Semitism being claiming that the Jews killed Christ. And those three Bible verses I just mentioned, they do say that. So it would give a legal framework to ban certain Bible verses. Now, this is nothing new. We saw this in episode 30. That was Kristi Noem, the Republican governor of South Dakota, and she signed HB 1076 into law. And it was pretty much the same bill. They also referenced the definition of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. So this is nothing new. This is being pushed all over the place. And we are seeing a lot of outrage over it, thank goodness. It did not receive too much attention when Kristi Noem signed it, into the bill, into law, I mean. But now, even people like Paul Joseph Watson and Matt Walsh of the Daily Wire, and if I'm not mistaken, Mark Dice, although I'm not sure, so please do double check on that. But it's receiving a lot of outrage. People are angry. But the reason we're seeing this being passed is due to these ongoing college campus anti-white protests. And they are used as a pretext to criminalize Christianity. And why do I say anti-white protests? These are the so-called anti-Israel protests. But really, if you analyze the vocabulary and the speech of these protesters, you can see that they are framed inside the anti-white narrative. They talk about decolonizing Israel, or actually they say decolonize Palestine. And If you're new here, let me just give you an overview of why this is the anti-white narrative. So in the anti-white narrative, the colonists are white people. This is fiction. It was the age of discovery. Europeans, they sailed around the world and they discovered new continents, new races of man they had never been in contact with, etc. Discovered new trade routes on sea. And yes, there were some criminals, pirates, and criminal entities, syndicates like the East India Company. They were not too good. But the overwhelming majority of Europeans, they spread the faith in good faith, and they brought Christianity to the world, civilization to parts of the world where civilization had never existed. But in the anti-white narrative, this is all framed as colonialism, where the white man, the colonist, just brutally raped, murdered, enslaved, etc., and stole resources, even though many of these people meeting the Europeans for the first time had never practiced metallurgy, for example, and had no wheel or writing system. So, of course, they had never used many natural resources like metals. And so it's all framed in the anti-white narrative, the colonists, the colonization, it's all anti-white rubbish. And you see these protesters calling the Israelis colonists, and they want to quote unquote decolonize it. So it's framed in the anti-white narrative. And we have talked about it before, how anti-whiteism is spilling over, and non-whites and Jews, even Ashkenazi Jews, are now a victim of anti-whiteism. It is collateral damage. It's targeted at whites, but non-whites are now collateral damage. This is the fact of the matter. Brothers, any extra input on that, or are we good to keep rolling?
Yeah, I think it's just worth expanding on that a little more for people to understand. This is something that has been built up in weird ways, and to truly understand it, it's also because Jewish people in particular are not unsuccessful. They kind of stand out in the anti-white coalition because they tend to be financially okay. If they're not upper class or very wealthy, they're at least middle class. There's very few, you know very poor or unemployed Jewish people. They tend not to have this problem in their community, and because many of them are lighter complexioned and white passing, because they either look Middle Eastern or they even look, you know, a little bit similar to us after residing in Europe for many generations. And so not only is there a bit of a look that makes it to where they kind of don't fit the anti-white coalition perfectly, but there's also the success. They tend to be normal middle class or upper middle class people, and this, of course, a hatred of that kind of person is used against white people in the anti-white narrative. If you're white and you're successful and middle class, it means you stole it from other people. And like you said, these kinds of ideas are spilling over into this particular community, which is why I think we are seeing in the last several years this huge ramping up of this focus on anti-Semitism and this focus on, the suffering of Jews in the past, perceived or otherwise, where they're trying to remind everyone in the anti-white coalition, like, no, 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 we're victims too, even though we're successful. And yes, Israel might be expanding its territory and it's the strong, powerful country in this conflict. In the grand scheme of things, though, no, Jews are victims, and people don't like us, and they have to reinsert themselves into the victim narrative, in the anti-white narrative. They have to put themselves back in the victim category so that the anti-white narrative can continue to be focused on white people and not accidentally focused on them in these situations. And so that's a bit more context kind of for the average person to understand why this matters to us.
Indeed. But why do they need this bill? There are many groups already existing that do push anti-whiteism and have been trying to ban Bible verses for at least a decade, definitely longer. And they've always used various pretexts. But why right now? Why are they pushing this bill? And we see it there in Congress. And like I said before, we saw it in South Dakota. And there were other states too. I just can't remember which ones. But why do you think it's being pushed right now, this bill?
Well, really, I think it's because the moment is right, where a lot of people, and as we know, there are many conservatives, particularly, who have a certain loyalty to Israel, and when they see what they perceive to be simply protests against Israel, they immediately side with Israel, and it's easy to take advantage of the moment because it's like, all these conservatives see all these protests happening in college campuses, and even graduation ceremonies are getting canceled, and they think this is terrible, this is outrageous, and the and so the anti-whites who want to push it through, they know that there's a lot of conservatives who will be applauding this because they don't like these protesters and they see it as a way to take them out. But really, it's laying the groundwork for the eventual criminalization of Christianity. So I think that's why it's happening right now.
Well, and the other reason why is it's all just about escalation. They like you mentioned, there are lots of groups that advocate, for the well-being and for the safety and for the rights and the care of Jewish people, whether it's the ADL or the International, Congress of Rabbis, and all of there's dozens of groups that are explicitly Jewish groups that push for Jewish interests and the protection of Jewish people, and trying to pass laws and protections in many countries, whether it's in Europe or Canada, where they're trying to outlaw talking about certain aspects of World War II or other, parts of history. They're passing laws where you can go to jail for life, for offending this group. And those laws are being passed because these non-governmental agencies do a very good job of advocating for their own group. So why do we need this law in the United States? Well, the answer is they don't need it. But think about what it gains. In this bill, as you mentioned in the beginning, this bill doesn't provide a definition of what anti-Semitism is. It's not like they wrote a law that says, anti-Semitism is now illegal, and anti-Semitism is anyone who coerces, intimidates, or otherwise attacks or oppresses the rights of a Jewish person or a Jewish group of people. They didn't provide a definition like that. In this bill, what it says is that the International Holocaust Remembrance Institute, which is it's basically a big think tank of people from the United Kingdom, the European Union, the United States, Israel, anywhere where there are a lot of very politically active, and powerful Jewish people. They come together and they form this group called the International Holocaust Remembrance Institute. And the law basically says that anti Semitism is whatever this group says it is. And they don't even give the definition that that group says anti Semitism is today. They just say it's whatever they say it is, which means that if this law is to pass, that definition can change anytime that group changes its definition. So if a judge in 2030 has a case brought before him where someone says this person is being anti Semitic, and the judge says, okay, let's look at what the law says anti Semitism is. It says whatever this group says that it is, the International Holocaust Remembrance Institute. So then they go to the International Holocaust Remembrance Institute and says, hey, what is anti Semitism? they can come up with any definition they like. And that's now anti-Semitism. And that person can be found guilty of it. So this really isn't a law in so much as it is a government backup of force and punishment that they're now giving to a non-governmental Jewish group that pushes for the interests of Jewish people. And I'm not opposed to groups of Jewish people coming together to fight for their own well-being and to push their interests. I think all groups should have these groups, including Western kind, including us. But what the United States government is doing here is basically abdicating their responsibility to define what a crime is. And they're going to allow this international globalist group to be able to look at every individual future accusation of anti-Semitism and say, yep, that's anti-Semitism. It falls into the category of what we defined it as, and they get to do it with impunity. So it completely removes the law and government of the United States from the process of defining what anti-Semitism is. It's basically as if Congress were to pass a law saying being anti-black is now illegal. If you're anti-black, we can throw you in prison. Well, what does being anti-black mean? It's whatever BLM says it means. That's basically what this law is, but for a Jewish group. So it doesn't matter what group this law is really for. It is a horrible law with no clear definition of what rule you can break. The rule is ever changing, and it can turn into anything tomorrow. It can turn into, well, it can basically turn into if anyone says that the Jews ever did anything wrong in history, now that's anti-Semitism. And as you brought up before, well, there's certain Bible verses, there's a lot of Bible verses where Jesus was saying that the Jews at the time were doing something wrong in that time. So could they now outlaw the Bible as anti-Semitic because it's a lot of verses that say that certain Jews in a certain place at certain times were doing things that someone thought was incorrect? Because now the definition of anti-Semitism is saying that Jews ever did anything wrong. And very well, that could be possible. People might scoff at that, but I think we've seen enough escalation and we've seen enough ridiculousness. You know, you can now get fired from your job for saying that a man can't turn into a woman and a woman can't turn into a man. Basic truths of reality now can destroy you both economically and socially. So why would it be so crazy to think that this law could morph into something like that? It has that potential. So the law isn't needed, but it basically grants this certain group, this advocacy group for one group of people, government power, even though they're not part of the government.
Well said.
It almost seems like we're transitioning from rule of law, where the law is derived from our traditions and our morals and our biospiritual expressions, to one of a foreign group of tribal elders ruling according to what's best for their people and completely disregarding what's best for anyone else's people. Maybe that's a little too abstract, but that's just kind of how I was visualizing this all as we were discussing it.
No, you're absolutely right. This is a group of people that are of a certain ethnic or religious, however you'd like to define it, group. And the United States government is basically saying they get to decide if you committed a crime or not, and will punish you based on what they say. Like, so no, you're not wrong. It is a group of tribal elders that has nothing to do with the people that this law governs. And they now get to decide what is a crime or not. And they can change the definition of that crime anytime they like.
Indeed. And the impact of it is now we see the separation of the wheat from the chaff in real time. Those Christians who will cuck, they are the rocky soil. Remember the parable of the sower? He goes out and he casts his seeds, right, onto his field, and some go onto the wayside and they're picked up by the birds. Some seeds, they end up in the rocky soil, and some amongst the thorns and the briars, and some in the good soil. we will now see who is the rocky soil and the thorn amongst the thorns and the briars. This analogy, this parable is so good. The wayside, those are the ones who hear the word but don't understand it. They will never pick up the faith. The rocky soil, they don't have any roots. They don't have any deep roots, no understanding. And so in the next storm, they're just blown away. And then the thorns and the briars, they do grow roots, strong roots. There is understanding, but all just the harshness in this world suffocates them. And then there's the good soil, those who bear fruit, right? And we will really now see the Christians who are not this good soil, who will just be cowards. It's almost a Bible prophecy just coming into fruition. It's pretty exciting, to be honest, to that part, but not this whole thing. But anything on that before we move on to these solutions?
Well, yeah, I think you're right. I think the way to put it, though, is that we're going to see who are actually Christians in heart and action versus who are Christians simply in name and claim. Because kind of like we were saying, so there are two things that are actually mentioned in this law that are definable. So there's a lot that's not defined, such as what is anti-Semitism. But there were a couple of examples that were also given, and two of them were dual loyalty and blood libel. Now, everyone knows what dual loyalty is. Basically, what this law would do is make it illegal for you to ever say to a Jewish person, like, I think you care more about Israel than the United States, even though you live here. They would basically make that illegal. You could never make that assertion about any Jewish person. That would become illegal because that's the act of accusing someone of dual loyalty. One thing that a lot of people, even a lot of Christians, are unfamiliar with is the concept of blood libel. The concept of blood libel, when you say it about Jewish people, is if you say that the Jewish people in Judea 2,000 years ago asked the Romans to kill Jesus. That's what the blood libel is. They call that blood libel. It's a term where they basically say that you're accusing the Jews of killing God. And there's a right and a wrong way to say it. If you say it the way I just said it, like, oh yeah, when Jesus was crucified, it was because there was a certain group of, Sadducees and Pharisees and stuff who were asking the Romans to kill him. But then there's a lot of other people who say things like, oh, well, the Jews killed Jesus and therefore they're all evil, So there's a right way and a wrong way to say it. But what this law would basically say or do is make it to where anytime you ever brought up that the Jews asked the Romans to kill Jesus, that you're now committing anti-Semitism, you're breaking the law. So in effect, that's a whole section of the New Testament that no preacher would ever be able to say on a pulpit again. You'd never be able to read those verses out loud, maybe not even in the privacy of your own home if anyone was to overhear you. Or if you take it a step further, would this make it to where now they could lobby that should be removed from the Bible because it's the actual written record of the so-called blood libel? And those kinds of things are the things that Christians really need to think about when it comes to a law like this. Once you outlaw this completely undefined idea of anti-Semitism that gets to be decided by a different group of people that isn't even part of the government, and they're allowed to change the definition, and if something as specific as the blood libel is mentioned, how far can they take it? They could virtually cut entire books out of the Bible and remove that forever. For anyone who buys a Bible in the future, they could never even see the verse about Pilate washing his hands and the Sadducees telling him to crucify Jesus and them freeing Barabbas in his place. That entire story could theoretically be removed from any future Bible that's printed, and old Bibles that have it in there might even be able to be confiscated.
Yeah.
One of those things that sounds ridiculous now, but I mean, it's one of those things where if people got used to the idea, when it does finally start happening, people would say, well, it should happen. What becomes a ridiculous idea in the past becomes the reality and people just blindly accept it. So, for anyone listening, don't laugh at that suggestion because it's certainly within the realm of possibility.
Well, yeah, and it's one of those things that people really have to learn how to see the long game. Like, why are people doing something so silly today, and what can it be used in the future? And a really good one that I'll bring up, because I think a lot of people can understand this one, is making TV shows and movies where they cast non-white people as white historical figures. A lot of us have talked about this in the past. It's the anti-white practice of erasing us from our own history. It's white erasure in the media. So they'll make a movie about Marie Antoinette and cast her as a black or a Hispanic woman. Or when they made that new Snow White movie and they cast a Hispanic woman as Snow White, even though the whole reason her name is Snow White is because she had snow white skin. Why are they doing that? Why are they doing something so silly in the present day? And the reason why is that it's not for us, it's for our children. You and me, who grew up being taught the original stories and watching the original movies, we know that those are our stories. We know that King Richard the Lionheart was British with red hair and spoke French in his court. We know that Marie Antoinette and we know that Anne Boleyn and all of these other historical figures were white Europeans of Western kind. But what happens when everyone switches to streaming and nobody owns DVDs or old movies or old books, and everything is electronic, and all the old history books can now be deleted? All the old storybooks for children can now be deleted because no one has hard copies, they just have Kindles. And all the old movies about these characters that were casted appropriately are now deleted. And the only movies that your grandchildren can stream are movies where these characters are played by non-white people. And the only books or the storybooks that they can read are storybooks and books that say that those people were non-white people. Your grandchildren will have no idea that those people were white. They can now make them whoever they want because they're laying the groundwork for future generations to only see this one image. So passing this law today, oh yeah, it just means you can't protest Israel. That's all it means today. But when your great grandchildren are born, if this law is used to edit the Bible, future generations of Christians will never even know the circumstances of Christ's crucifixion, and therefore, will there even be any future Christians? That's the kind of angle that our people never think of. They don't think 3 or 4 generations down the road. They think about me, myself, and I right now, not how will this affect our people for the next 100 years.
Very well said. And the solutions to put an end to all of this is to play by the rules? No, absolutely not. We have seen the anti-whites for decades not playing by the rules at all. And they've been very cunning. And one of the most cunning, evil bastards in history was Saul Alinsky in contemporary history. Saul Alinsky, who wrote the book Rules for Radicals. I have yet to read it, but Gentile gentleman over here, he has. Gentile, I want to give it over to you. Can you give us a brief history of how these anti-whites used protests to win over the masses, to gain sympathy, and how we should be doing the same thing, how we can learn from these people?
Yeah, absolutely. And first, what I want to say to our listeners is that I'm not glorifying Saul Alinsky. Saul Alinsky was a Satanist. He was an atheist person of a certain background. We don't have to mention it. And he dedicated his book to Satan. In the first page of Rules for Radicals, he dedicates the book to Satan because Satan was the first revolutionary. He was the first radical. He was the first person who ever stood up to authority, to power, and that power being God. So I'm not saying that we should adopt all the pretext of his book, because most of his book is evil. It just teaches people how to be evil. But the one section that is very useful for us to learn from, that the right wing, the white positive sphere, Christians, whatever group you want to call us on our side, we never understood what protesting really is and how it actually works. A lot of people on our side think that protesting is when you go out and you make a nuisance, you smash windows, you light fires, you basically riot. They think of protesting as a riot. And this is not actually the thinking behind protesting. The thinking behind protesting is to go out and do what is legal, to legally assemble, to petition the government for a redress of a grievance. So if you want to march, if you want to protest against this law, for example, say, hey, we shouldn't pass this law. It breaks down free speech. It's going to be used as an anti-white, anti-Christian platform in the future with impunity, and we want to stand up to it. What you have to do is to trick the regime in power into overreacting to your protest. This is how protesting is done properly. Why it's effective is you use it as a way to bait the people you want to make look like the tyrants, look evil, into overreacting to your protest so that you can then have video clips and audio and media to show to normal people who otherwise weren't involved. Look at the government, look at these cops beating up all these peaceful people who just wanted to peacefully protest. We've all heard those terms a lot lately, but this is nothing new. When you go back to the 1960s and you look at protesting in the civil rights movement, what are all the images that have survived? All the images that have survived is a bunch of cops, whacking black folks with billy clubs, firemen spraying them with fire hoses to break up their protests. So forever in the minds of people, the government was just this horrible thing back then, especially in the South, that just beat up all these poor innocent people for no reason, because they were able to trick them into overreacting. They protested and made just enough of a nuisance for themselves that some loose cannon, what you can depend on is the loose cannon, some cop with an itchy trigger finger. He's got his hand on his billy club and man, he really wants to hit somebody. So he's looking for an excuse to hit somebody. He doesn't represent the government as a whole, but you can frame it into how he represents the government as a whole. If you can just annoy that one guy into overreacting and hitting one of you, and then everyone around that person who just got hit starts screaming at him, and then 3 or 4 more cops come rushing up because they saw him hit somebody, so they assume he had good reason to hit him, and they start hitting somebody. And now you've got a melee where there's innocent people running away from these jackboot cops that are just beating everybody up. And it might not happen the first time you protest. This is why the left protests all the time. People on the right wing, people in the white positive sphere, we almost get sick of hearing about it because we're like, man, the left is protesting again? Why are they protesting all the time? Why do they protest pretty much every month about anything, about ridiculous things, about silly things? It's because each and every time they protest, that's an opportunity to trick the police, to trick the government into overreacting to them and spraying them with pepper spray or hitting somebody with a club. And then they get it on camera and they feed it to their people in the media, just like we have our people who have their own media, and they spread it around everywhere so that they can show how horrible police cops are, how they can show how horrible the government is, and how much they hate people who just want to stand up for these kinds of things. That's how protesting is meant to be used. It's not about actually causing damage. It's not about actually getting people to think that your protest was good. It's about tricking the regime in power into appearing authoritarian, violent, and tyrannical by attacking you. You protest 100 times in the hopes that just 2 or 3 times they accidentally overreact and beat the crap out of some people so that you can show it to everyone and turn everyone's opinion into thinking like, oh yeah, this regime in power is pretty bad. They're always beating people up in the streets, even though we have the right to peacefully assemble. They're always shooting rubber bullets and tear gas at people. These people obviously aren't in control People obviously don't like them, and they're obviously way too fast to resort to violence. And that is what they did to the old United States regime. The same regime that was hunting down communists in Hollywood and trying to stop all the race riots in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, they were made to look like the bad guy because of framing. And it was because of protesting and tricking them into overreacting to the protests. And we on the right have to learn to use this tactic. We need to get these left-wing mayors and their police departments that are headed by these left-wing death initiative people, these diversity, inclusion, equity, the DIE people, to start overreacting and beating people up in the street for simple, peaceful protests about things like this law. Because then normal people who are kind of partially involved but not really involved will see that and think, wow, these mayors are out of control. This government's out of control. They're just going around beating Americans up for no reason. The left did it perfectly. The anti-whites did it perfectly, and now they're in power because of sympathy. And we on the right wing have never learned how to manipulate and earn sympathy from the average person by using those kinds of tactics.
Right. I do want to say the swindle whites movement back in the 60s. I remember during the summer of anti-white terror back in 2020, some old footage and images came up to the surface again, showing cities in the South, towns and cities in black and white photographs, almost identical to images in 2020 of cities just burned to the ground, looted, destroyed, and that was like a red pill for me. I had never seen those images. The anti-whites back in that day, they did not just cause minor nuisance, but everything else pretty accurate. But they definitely destroyed cities, and then the police did not overreact at all. They, in my opinion, they reacted the way they should have. But of course, the anti-whites had the media completely on their side. There were no cell phones back in those days. Like these images that we still have today of those riots, destruction, they were probably, those images, those photos were taken by independent people and not by the media. And they never became mainstream. They never spread. So anyway, but
Yeah,
we have seen.
That was gonna be what I was gonna say is, yeah, the media back then was on their side, and they still have control of the media. They got control of the media first, and that was probably the smartest move they ever made. But now that we have people in media, people that can reach hundreds of thousands of people and spread these things, and if you can get people that aren't even necessarily involved in our circles to come across it and they start spreading things, we really can make an effect on media like we never could before. And we're trying to use it appropriately, but we don't have anyone out there using these tactics appropriately that we can share video of. Like we talked about before we started recording, I'll give an example of how not to do it. And this is how the right wing, the people who are trying to be the white positive sphere, but really they're playing the villain, they do it wrong, like in Charlottesville. When you get a bunch of guys together and they're all wearing military fatigues and military boots and body armor, and they've got shields and clubs, and they're waving swastikas around, or they're waving Celtic crosses and stuff around, symbols that already have a bad reaction from the average person in the public, and you're dressing in military fatigues, no one's going to be sympathetic to you because you came to fight. And so that's not going to earn sympathy. If you look back, on the protests, of the 1950s and 60s, it wasn't a bunch of guys wearing military uniforms running around in jackboots with shields and batons. And yes, of course, that did happen. They did burn down cities, they rioted and all that, but they had the media on their side, so they could hide that. So we have to do it the right way. We have to go out there and hold up signs that just say, no more anti-whiteism. Stop anti-whites, white positive, not signs that say the Jews are going to replace us, or signs that say, something crazy like Hitler was right. If you go out there and you've got these guys in your protest and they're giving the other side's media images like that to show, no matter what images you show, it's going to cancel itself out. So the right is simply protesting wrong. We've got to go out there and we've got to look nice. We've got to dress nice. Our signs have to say nice things like it's okay to be white. Our signs have to say things, and the way we behave has to make us look sympathetic. And we are very bad at making ourselves look sympathetic because we want to look strong. The right-wing mindset is to look strong. It's to look tough. It's to look like you're in charge. But when you do that, people are less likely to be sympathetic to you when you get into a fight. People are sympathetic to the little guy. They're sympathetic to the little guy who's getting beat up by the big guy. It's about manipulating people's emotions, and the anti-whites are so good at it. And if we don't start using those kinds of tactics, we're never going to be able to stand up to them. Because as long as you can manipulate people's emotions and get them on your side, and anti-whites are the only people doing that, we will never get more people on our side.
Exactly. You did mention the "it's okay to be white" stickers. That indeed got the anti-whites to really drop their mask and overreact. I mean, the FBI was hunting people who put up those stickers. That was just insane. And people see that and they think, holy moly, maybe there is something more to this anti-whiteism. It wakes people up. And let me list a few more examples. Do you remember the woman who was arrested outside of an modern day Baal worship and Baal sacrificial rite? She was protesting outside for the babies. I'm sorry, she was praying outside for the babies. And she was arrested. That was an overreaction by the regime. That was a total overreaction. She was not well known by anyone, I think, but she became a sort of a martyr when she was arrested. And many Christians online were outraged and were talking about it. And this is something that creates sympathy for us. And now, currently, the protests in Ireland, this was a disgusting case. We retweeted it on our Twitter account, Western Kind for Christ. I think the username is at Westman Christ. Western Kind for Christ was too long. Okay. So anyway, Western Kind for Christ on Twitter. We retweeted this last week. This was just a disgusting attack on the people who were peacefully protesting white erasure in Ireland. And the police, they rushed onto them and they beat them with clubs. They were peacefully protesting, and the anti-whites, they overreacted. And then I want to mention the protests on Patriots Day, January 6th, back in 2021. The protesters, some of them were agent provocateurs, saboteurs, and were breaking windows and so on. And maybe some people were just genuinely angry. Anyway, but the regime totally overreacted when they murdered Ashley Babbitt. They shot her in the head. And that created sympathy for us. And then finally, I want to mention the protests of Christians outside a church in Canada. This was during the summer of anti-white terror. They were, and of course, the virus. They were keeping the 6 feet apart rule, not breaking it. And they were just sitting there or standing 6 feet apart and just praying and singing psalms, lighting candles or something, and they were arrested by the police. And this created a lot of outrage, a lot of sympathy for us, and a lot of outrage.
No, you're right. Those are perfect examples of what we should be doing. And the other thing, too, is that the right wing needs to hold their attention on things longer. You know, anti-whites were talking about George Floyd for years. His face was everywhere. Why hasn't anyone on our side painted a mural of Ashley Babbitt somewhere on the side of a wall and then taken pictures of it and posted it online so people can share it around? Why haven't people on our side continued to share her story, her picture? Military veteran on disability, shot and killed for walking through the Capitol. You know, why aren't we continuing to push these narratives? We get really upset about it, you know, for a day and a month after it happens, and then we let it go. Like, how many people listening right now know the names of any of the Patriots Day, the January 6th protesters who are still in prison right now, years later, held in solitary confinement, awaiting trial for misdemeanor charges that they probably are going to get dropped or found innocent of? How many of you know their names? How many of you have seen their pictures floating around on the internet recently? It doesn't happen because we forget about it so soon. We have to keep these things circulating. That's another thing that anti-whites do effectively is they have martyrs. And they never let you forget about those martyrs. When I say the name Trayvon Martin, everyone knows his name. Everybody. When we say the name Ashley Babbitt, people in our circles remember her name. But if I was to go to a random person on the street right now and say, hey, do you remember Ashley Babbitt? They would probably have no idea who she is because we do such a poor job of continuing to put these people in people's attention, in their minds, in their memory. And so the tragedies and the murders and the unjust arrests against people like us, these anti-white actions get forgotten because we don't continue to talk about them. We just autistically move on to the next thing and we let it go. So there's no continuum of our victimization. You know, you go talk to a person and be like, yeah, you're really anti-white. Like, I can't believe you hate white people like you do. Oh, well, what about so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so? And they can rattle off 30 names of their supposed victims, their supposed martyrs. And you go to people on our side, the white positive sphere, and we don't remember anyone on our side that they victimized. Virtually no one. You know, and so we have to do a better job about a lot of those kinds of things because they are effective. That's why the anti-whites do it, because it's extremely effective. And we have to start doing it because that's what's going to give us results. It's not just about making sure we use the right phrases. We should be using anti-white. We should be using white erasure. We should be using white victimization. But we also need to have the martyrs. We need to attach those words to Ashley Babbitt. Anti-white murder in the Capitol, you know, anti-white people held in prison for misdemeanor charges for the January 6 guys who are still in prison. We have to start attaching it to people, to feelings, emotions, to martyrs, to events, and do a much better job of having a continuous story of our victimization, the way the anti-whites do. They can tell a whole story, a whole anti-white story starting hundreds of years ago about how evil and awful we are. We can't tell a 10-minute story because we just forget everything bad that they do to us.
That is a good point. I think Tommy Lind, the Swedish teenage boy or young adult, the white guy who protected a white girl from being raped by an anti-white, and the anti-white, he got up of the girl and stabbed Tommy Lind to death, and then continued raping the girl. Tommy Lind became a martyr in Europe for a while, and especially Sweden, but then it kind of died out. I think most people, even I, can't recall his exact name. See? That's on me. I apologize, but I think his name was Tommy Lind. Yeah, most of our people, they never become martyrs, and that's a shame. I even have, or we have a list of hush crimes of white children just horrendously murdered. But yeah, this is you are spot on. We do have to make martyrs.
Well, and it's like I said, it's all of our fault. It's a collective fault because we aren't learning. We aren't learning to play this modern political game that our enemy is playing. We're still living in the pluralist idea that, well, if we just get enough people to vote for it, we can fix it. Because we're going to vote in new laws and we'll vote in some new politicians and they're just going to take care of everything for us and it's going to be so great. Can't you tell? We're still playing this old game. We still think we're living in old America. The rules of the game have changed. The way to get people to vote the way you want, the way to get people to come together the way that you need has changed. And we have not adopted any of these policies. And again, we shouldn't be doing anything illegal. Anti-whites and, people on the left, whatever you want to call them, they do illegal things all the time. And I'll even give a great example of how they've screwed up. Antifa. When was the last time you heard about Antifa in the news? It's been a long time. They don't talk about them anymore because Antifa screwed up. They got too cocky. They thought they had more power than they did at a certain time, and they overreacted. They overstepped their bounds. Back in 2016, that one guy who got hit in the head with a bike lock by that college teacher. And then everyone on 4chan found that college teacher and got him arrested and had him sent to jail. Now, no anti-whites talk about Antifa. Their name is pretty much blacklisted. They don't want to talk about them anymore because Antifa was good ammunition for us because they were going out there and breaking the law and they were attacking people in the streets and they were explicitly saying they wanted to attack people in the streets. And our version of that mistake was Gavin McInnes and the Proud Boys because Gavin McInnes was shooting his mouth off like, oh yeah, no, we're going to show up to the protest and we're going to fight them. Oh yeah, we're going to beat them up. It's going to be great. And then everyone had that video and that sound clip. So every time a Proud Boy got into a fight with an Antifa member, the news could play it and be like, no, see, the Proud Boys went there to fight. They're the problem. So I'm not saying we should break the law. I'm not saying we should start acting like Antifa. I'm not saying any of those things. What I'm saying is we need to peacefully protest. We need to come out as Christians. And like you said, we need to pray in front of these child murdering centers. We need to go out and pray or protest outside of schools that are trying to indoctrinate children with transgenderism and all these other things. And we need to do it legally and peacefully. And we have to do it enough to piss off enough people so that they'll start calling the cops on these protests. And eventually some guy with an itchy trigger finger, some gay, lesbian, transgender police officer is really going to want to smash a Christian with a billy club. And they're going to make a mistake. They're going to start beating somebody up that they shouldn't. And then we get the ammunition that we need. And that's the right way to do it, is you do it legally and you trick them into overreacting. So we're not promoting anything illegal here, people. I'm just telling you the way that it's used effectively and we can do it. And we do need to make martyrs. We need to be remembering the people that are effective for our side. You walk into a room today and you say George Floyd, everyone instantly shuts up because they're like, oh crap, this is going to be a real conversation. Ashley Babbitt should have that same effect, and it's up to us to make that happen.
Amen to that. And let me remind you all of how Christianity was spread. It was by mainly two things: testimonies and martyrdom. The apostles, they understood how powerful testimonies are. When someone asks you, oh, why should I come to Jesus? You can give that person your personal testimony. It's so powerful. And we need testimonies. For example, when it comes to anti-whiteism, all these murdered children, all treated as hush crimes, we need their testimonies, and we need to make them into martyrs. We need martyrdom. And you also need to be ready to die a martyr. I'm very inspired by, what was his name? Richard, forget his last name. He was the German who lived in Romania. He wrote a book called Tortured for Christ. Richard Wurm, something.
Worms. Oh man, I know exactly who you're talking about because I have the book.
Yeah.
But you're right, I forget his name too because I think he was either Polish or Lithuanian or something. So he has one of those names that's hard to pronounce.
Oh, okay. I thought he was German descended living in Romania. Well, it doesn't matter.
Oh, maybe that's what I'm thinking. Yeah, he was just living in one of those countries.
Right. But anyway, the point is he was tortured in jail in communist Romania for 13 years straight. I'm not sure if I could take that, honestly. Like, if I had just half of his faith when the bleep hits the fan, that would be enough for me, I think. But man, his faith was extraordinary. But we need all to, we all have to be ready to become martyrs at some point, to die martyrs or to suffer his terrible fate. Yeah. But testimonies and martyrdom, folks. Remember that. Testimonies and martyrdom.
And you don't even have to die to become a martyr. In obviously religiously, when we think of martyrs, that's what we think of. What's his name? Rodney King. He didn't have to die. He just had to get hit a handful of times, and he was a martyr for years. So you don't even necessarily have to die for us to be able to have that kind of stuff. Martyrdom in the political sense doesn't involve you having to die. Again, it's just about being a symbol. It's being a symbol.
Oh yeah, you're right. I mean, exactly. The protesters of Patriots Day, who are now rotting in jail, all innocent, they are definitely martyrs. But like you said, I don't even know their names.
Yeah, no one does because we've just done this horrible job. We have all this opportunity. We have all this ammunition at our disposal, and we can all tie it into the lexicon, and we can all talk about how it's we got to come up with a new term for white imprisonment, add it to the lexicon. But yeah, we could be using all of these people for their martyrdom status, but also for adding it to the lexicon. And these people might even be free by now if we had been doing that. If people had been talking about them nonstop for the last few years, like no one stopped talking about George Floyd for 3 years, they might even be out by now. We do a really bad job of sticking together, and we have to be better about it. And like you said, as Christians, it's the same thing. When those Christians during COVID that were just praying, like you brought up, got arrested, how many Christians went out and protested after that? Not many. Virtually none. There should have been millions of us across the United States all doing the same thing. Like, oh, you're going to arrest them for going out and just praying, even though they're standing 6 or 7 feet apart? All Christians should have went out and started doing that. There should have been Christians in every downtown, in every major city, all standing 7 feet apart praying and daring the cops to come to arrest them. That's the right way to do protesting. That's the way that we win and get sympathy.
Spot on. All right, Phyllis, this has been an absolutely brilliant episode. High energy, very informative. I loved it. Any final words, brothers?
Those who are persecuted for the faith and who hold strong through it all, I mean, we shall be blessed.
Amen. I thank you all for listening. God bless you all. I love every single one of you. And take care now. Bye-bye.
But
Yeah, thank you everyone for listening. Hit the subscribe button, share the videos so that we can get this out to more people. And we really appreciate the support and the people that come and watch the videos every week. We thank you for being here.